Hey guys, gals, and non-binary pals, I'm your host Hannah, and this is Under the Scrubs. You know, I would say it is a happy Tuesday, but unfortunately, it is not. I am very sad to announce that 4/6, so yesterday, at approximately 17:10, Boba Fett, my sourdough starter, went up to the oven in the sky. He started growing some weird-ass mold on him. Don't know. Didn't care to find out if it was going to make me sick or not, so I had to yeet him into the trash. R.I.P. I actually might try and get my own sourdough starter now, but God knows how that's going to go. I will probably end up crawling back to my old coworker and telling her I need more, please. Today, we are talking about Michael Swango. This is episode 12. He is basically a serial killer, right? His method, though, was poisoning, and he claims like 4 or 5 or like how many he did, but it was actually more like 60, and it was patients and it was colleagues. Yikes. So you definitely don't want him at your potluck, if you know what I mean. I will just, keep my timeout pretty brief here. As we're headed into spring, unfortunately, I don't know if this is widely known, but the suicide rate goes up, right? Springtime, that's usually when they start kind of upticking, which you would think it's winter, right? So this is a nice little reminder to be kind to yourself and check in on your friends, especially if they think, or they tell you that they're doing okay. Check in on them. It's important. And just always know that you are loved. And if you don't feel like you are, just know that I love you and that my dog loves you and she loves everybody and everybody's great and wonderful. So I'm going to jump into this episode. So this is going to end up being more than one part. I don't like to do this, but unfortunately, I feel like I really have to tell his whole story in order to kind of grasp that, like, it wasn't just the hospital's fault for not catching him. I mean, the red flags had been popping up on this guy for quite some time. So the fact that he wasn't stopped until so many years later, that's what is like blowing my mind, right? So Michael Swango, he was considered an incredibly bright kid. He was born in 1954. He was the middle child out of 3 boys, and he just was the favorite child to a doting mother and an absent alcoholic militant father. He got better education than his brothers. He received top tier grades. He had this incredible love of music that took him really far and even into college. The type of kid that you look at and you go, yeah, you're going to go far one day. His initial dream was to become an Illinois state trooper. So approaching graduation in high school, he actually served as his class valedictorian and a national merit finalist with the highest test score. He would have been an absolute shoo-in for any major school, but unfortunately, with a lack of college guidance and information in his hometown, both his parents lacked a higher education outside the military, and you sprinkle in the fact that a majority of his classmates stuck around the town, Michael's horizon, which should have been massive, was very limited. He ended up choosing to go to college at a small liberal art school in Decatur, Illinois, called Millikan University. Michael continued his streak of phenomenal grades. I mean, he's top of his class, but something that happened his freshman year kind of seemed to alter him, right? So freshman year, he's the blonde, curly-haired, blue-eyed boy who normally wore sports jackets to class. He's all of a sudden started wearing military garb. He had an old Ford Fairlane that was painted he had painted it camouflage green. And so with this sudden abrupt change, his friends queried about it, like, what's going on? Michael told them that he was planning on joining the military and all of a sudden began this fascination with guns. This would also be the first time that Michael mentions anything about, pre-med as an interest. And then he followed up this weird-ass conversation with showing his friends pictures of really intense car crashes. So by the end of Michael's sophomore year, he was isolating himself more and more. And then in the summer, he's not going to come back to school. He ends up enrolling in the Marines, and he would go on to complete basic training. He'd be trained as a rifleman, and he even earned the title sharpshooter. In 1976, when he was working at camp, I don't know if it's Lejeune or Lejeune. We'll call it Lejeune. He would receive an honorable discharge, and he would eventually just come back home to Quincy. It is then that Michael announced to his family that he's going to pursue becoming a physician. With his academic success, he had zero issue getting into school and completing his prereqs, and he actually transferred from a local community college to Quincy College. Now, with his academics, why did he feel the need to lie on his record? On a form he had submitted to the college's public information office, he claimed that he had received a Bronze Star for heroism in combat on top of a Purple Heart for combat wounds during his short time in the Marines. Both of those awards were never given to him. I mean, he had a 3.89 GPA and he double majored in chemistry and biology. So I feel like that was really unnecessary to like try and embellish yourself. Also, those things, like, you can look them up, right? So his senior year, Michael wrote his senior thesis in chemistry about the poisoning murder of a writer. And maybe this is some foreshadowing, right? Michael goes on to graduate in 1979 summa cum laude, and he won the American Chemical Society's Award for academic success. At this period in time, medical school admissions were incredibly intense. The baby boom generation has begun graduating from college in the late 60s, and then they are just applying in masses to professional schools. And I mean, this is schools with high repute all the way down to like the schools where you're like, where the hell is that? You know, the ones that are like so small or uncommon that people have never heard of it. There were students that were, I mean, they'll apply to every known med school and they were rejected to everyone. And so they would migrate either down to like Mexico or another foreign country just to go to med school down there. Michael ended up being accepted to Southern Illinois University, and he began his medical school journey here. Michael really made a name for himself. There was literally a verb called swangoing, which referred to the way that he would study in between tests. He would run out to the hallway and cram as much as he could. But their cadaver lab in their first year really showed some red flags and really made Michael known to everybody. So during your first year of med school, you go through your cadaver lab where you learn to dissect, you know, I don't want to say practice on a human body, but basically, right? These are people that have donated their body to science. And so if you mess up, no harm, no foul, they've already passed, right? And it's a good way for you to see real life organs and see and learn from the body versus, you know, looking at some glossy pages in a book. The students were grouped up and assigned one part of their cadaver to dissect, and then they would turn around and present that to the group. Michael was assigned the hip and buttock area, and now while regular students would come in during the day, like normal people, or during lab hours, or times when teachers would be present so they could ask questions, get help, get some guidance, Michael would come in the middle of the night. There were some members in his group that swore he never went to lab, and that's because he's there, you know, while everybody else is sleeping. So he really lacked any kind of guidance, and he was essentially kind of self-teaching himself to dissect. But when it came time to present, his cohort gasped, and they were absolutely shell-shocked at what they saw. Michael had transformed this hip into something that was completely unrecognizable. It's just a mess of tangled flesh and bone. One student recalls saying that they thought that he had done the dissection with a chainsaw rather than a scalpel. Even Michael himself realized that he couldn't really describe the region's anatomical characteristics thanks to his own handiwork. In his third year of medical school, Michael started his surgical rotation. He was assigned a surgery buddy in his class, Rosenthal, and they did oral presentations on whatever topic they chose. Rosenthal suggested open heart surgery as that was a personal topic for him. And he never really worked with Michael during this, though, right? And let's be real, group projects, they're, you know, it's like one person does all the work or maybe two. But Rosenthal and Michael essentially kind of did their own presentations, even though they were supposed to do them together. Rosenthal didn't like Michael. He thought he was really weird. He thought he was really intense. Michael was working as an EMT at the time, and so their schedules didn't align, and Michael would get like a page and he would just be up out of the room. So when they gave their presentation, Michael's was mid at best. Another incident is when the class was discussing chest x-rays. The professor points to the middle part of the chest. It's a shadowy area. And he asked Michael, "What is that?" Okay, well, I mean, let's think about it, right? It's a chest. It's in the center. And it's shadowy. It's probably the heart, right? Michael tells him that he doesn't know. And the professor makes sure to really emphasize that it's the heart. Another one of those medical mishaps in school that his classmates really remember. And so the further that Michael gets into medical school, the more red flags start popping up. When the students need to practice doing history and physicals, or as we call them in the field, H&Ps, it really depends on the patient, but those can take you anywhere between half an hour to an hour. I mean, you are getting a complete medical history, of the patient, maybe, maternal, paternal, family members, family history, things like that. And then you're doing a full head to toe assessment. Michael was getting them done in as little as like 5 minutes. A classmate spoke up and claimed that Michael had to be forging his assessments, which triggered another round of talk amongst his cohort about his competency. So, keeping that cadaver debacle in mind, Michael chose neurosurgery to focus on that third year of medical school. Sweeney was Michael's surgery buddy for neurosurgery, and despite the fact that they would basically see each other every day, they avoided each other as much as possible. Normally, if you share a specialty, you observe the other one's procedures, but they stayed out of each other's rooms. Sweeney's like, "I don't want to watch that guy. He's scary as shit." Michael was like, "I'm not going in that room." The resident that they were assigned to, Mark Zawodniak, was considered to be a really genial and friendly guy, and he even developed a distaste for Michael. He even told Sweeney one day, "What did I do to fucking deserve him?" But a faculty neurosurgeon, Dr. Lyle Wacusser, thought Michael was great. They became besties. He's not going to listen to any criticism of Michael's haste, sloppy habits, or his indifference to patient care. Dr. Wacusser was a highly respected neurosurgeon in the area, so the fact that he's championing Michael made him look so much better than he actually was. A surgeon that was actually really bad at his job, but he had a doctor vouch for him, sounding maybe a little Christopher Dunch-esque. So that third year of medical school, students get a lot more of face time with the patient. Rosenthal had noticed that Michael took an immediate interest in the sickest of the patients. And so the hospital had, keep in mind, this is like back in the 70s, right? The hospital had a massive whiteboard, and it would have patient names up there and treatment remarks. And if a patient had expired, Michael would go up to that blackboard and write in big bold letters, "Died," across that person's name. Others find this, gross, upsetting, almost kind of get like a celebratory feeling from Michael when he did this. Effie Walls was a patient who had passed suddenly after Michael visited her, and so he wrote "died" on that blackboard. And Rosenthal asked him, "Hey, don't you feel bad that she died?" To which Michael replied, "No, that's just what happens." Like, this happened so often, the running joke of the class was that if you wanted to get rid of a patient, you gave them to Michael for an H&P. Even the resident, Zawodniak, told Sweeney that every time he assigned Michael to do an H&P on a patient, they suddenly coded. He's like, "Do you really think that, do you think this is a coincidence?" And I mean, they kind of laughed it off because you don't want to think that, that this isn't just a coincidence, Michael earned the nickname 00 Swango, so like 007, License to Kill, after 5 patients who were recovering just fine after surgeries had died after their H&P with Michael. His last year of medical school in 1982, Michael's father had passed. His mother, Muriel, had given him this scrapbook of articles that contained horrific car crashes, disasters, and other incidents of violent death. First of all, why even have that shit? That's weird. All right. Because Michael was apparently making his own little scrapbooks with the same kind of stuff as a child. And that continued into adulthood. A coworker had asked Michael why he cut out those articles and pictures, to which he replied, "If I'm ever accused of murder, the scrapbooks will prove that I'm not mentally competent. This will be my defense." Which, at the time they laugh it off, but I think it's like one of those times where you actually tell the truth about something and it's so absurd, you just kind of laugh because you're like, there's no way that that's real. So with all these red flags, does anyone try and step in and really have this guy looked at? No. Instead, he got a glowing recommendation letter from Dr. Wakaser, the only time that he had ever gone to such lengths for a student. Michael ends up securing a neurosurgery internship at the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics in Iowa City. Before he can go to his internship, though, he has to finish out his last rotation in OBGYN. The doctor, Robert Prentice, had never worked with an SIU student before, so the school is really hoping that Michael could wow them and, set a good archetype for their school. He did not deliver on that. In fact, he didn't deliver anything. He never showed up to shadow Dr. Prentice. He never did any deliveries, C-sections, hysterectomies. Dr. Kathleen O'Connor was the chief resident in OBGYN at the SIU hospitals, and she was in charge of overseeing Michael's work. She tried locating him multiple times, but was told, he's off working as an EMT. She had heard through the grapevine that his activities as an EMT had recently been restricted. He was actually banned from direct patient contact, but she was never told why. But Dr. O'Connor was more worried about his absence from rotation more than his performance as an EMT. When she finally caught him one day, she asked for him to do an H&P on a patient that was scheduled for a C-section. He goes in, 10 minutes later comes out. Shortly after, he turns in a 3-page write-up that seems a little too perfect and polished. Dr. O'Connor goes in to chat with the patient and find out through that patient that Michael barely talked to her, let alone even touched her. Dr. O'Connor takes this to the full OBGYN faculty, where they convene to talk about his status on this rotation. They're heading towards failing him, which means that he wouldn't be able to graduate. This also triggered a hearing on Michael before the Student Progress Committee. Michael catches wind of this, and on the outside, he's very calm, cool, collected, but on the inside, he's wearing a tap-out shirt, drinking a Monster, punching holes in walls type of mad. So what does he do? He goes out and hires a goddamn lawyer. Now the school is spooky scared that he's going to sue. Okay, the students start dividing, either in support of Michael being failed, or they're like, no, let him stay. Dr. Wakaser comes to Michael's side, talking about how great Michael is. Dr. Murphy, the pathology and toxicology professor, was so worked up talking to the dean in support of Michael that he started crying. The students in support of Michael said that the failing of him would be too far of a punishment. But this is such a paradox, though, right? So many people are rejected from medical school or waitlisted and had their dreams shattered, but they almost never expel them once they're in. Rosenthal jumped on the get Michael out of here wagon, and he wrote a very strongly worded letter to the Student Progress Committee and said, Michael's got to go. There were others that wrote in saying that Michael was incompetent, and he has been since the first year. He hasn't been progressing like the rest of this class. They're bringing up, all this other crazy shit that they saw within their first year. His attitudes towards medical education seemed to border contempt. There was a collective feeling that they never even wanted Michael to be their doctor, ever. So in May 1982, the committee met and they were considering expelling Michael. When Dr. O'Connor goes to get the H&P that Michael wrote so she can present it, it's gone. She starts frantically looking for the other reports, and now somehow those are missing too. So now she's lost her evidence, but she's like, screw this, I'm not going to let this go. She goes on verbally to argue her point and about Michael's poor performance in his OBGYN rotation. Other allegations from the letters from the students were read, and Michael even showed up to testify on his own behalf. And boy, did he pull out the waterworks. He uses the death of his father as a crutch. He lied and said he was a sole supporter for his mom and 2 brothers, and that if he was expelled, it would be such a hardship since he would lose his internship. Most of the members were unmoved. A chairman named William Roddick calls Michael a bald-faced liar and said that alone should be enough to let him go. Deliberations started, and when the committee took its vote, 8 members voted to kick his ass out, 1 abstained, and 1 said, give him a chance. So the school's lawyer and Michael's lawyer ended up starting a series of negotiations, and they reached a compromise that averted litigation because, let's be real, that's what they got scared about, is if they're going to kick his ass out, now they're scared, oh no, are we going to get sued? So these lawyers get together, they start chit-chatting, and they come to the agreement that Michael wouldn't be allowed to graduate, but he wouldn't be expelled or asked to withdraw. He would have to repeat his OBGYN rotation, and he would be given assignments from some of the faculty's strictest professors. All these professors were made aware of the allegations against him, so if he were to pass these assignments, then yeah, he can graduate. He fails them, he's out. So graduation day approaches June 5th, 1982, and Michael is not in the ceremony. University of Iowa rescinds their offer for internship, and he lies to his family that showed up to watch him. They pass it off as like, oh, it's a computer mix-up, and then like it magically dropped him from the list of graduates. So Michael goes on to repeat that last year of medical school, and he aces everything he needs to, actually attends his OBGYN rotation. Every graduating medical student gets what's called a dean's letter. It reviews the student and talks about their strengths and weaknesses, and this letter is used with all the applications for residencies and internships. Dean Moy carefully wrote Michael's letter to draw attention to the fact that Michael didn't graduate with his cohort. He failed his OBGYN rotation and he had to repeat it, and that there was concern about his professional behavior. This was the closest the dean felt like he could get to the line without crossing into legal liability, because God forbid anybody gets sued. So the next match day in 1983, Dr. William Hunt, the director of the Department of Neurosurgery at Ohio State University in Columbus, offered Michael a neurosurgery residency after he completed a year of internship in general surgery that was slated to start July 1st. Ohio State was considered one of the most prestigious residency programs in the U.S. at the time. Out of the 12 people interviewed for this residency, Michael was the only one who was offered a position. So April 12th, 1983, Michael graduates finally from medical school. But little did anyone know that shortly after graduation, Michael was fired from America Ambulance. He was already on probation due to violent outbursts, but he had been responding to a call in Rochester for a heart attack. He shows up, that patient's gasping for air, they're having, chest pain. And when Michael was told that he needs to provide treatment and transfer, Michael opted to have the patient walk to his own car and have the family drive him instead. Luckily, the patient survived, but that family let America Ambulance know what the hell had happened, so Michael got the boot. But nothing had been reported to his medical school or anything, which I feel like would have been a really smart thing to do, but hey, that's just me. July comes around and Michael starts his rotations through different surgery specialties for his general in Ohio State. Dr. Ronald Ferguson was a transplant doctor, and he saw Michael mid-October to mid-November. And he told Hunt, that Dr. Hunt, the head of neurosurgery, that he's like, hey, I'm going to have to fail Michael. I don't think he's competent. He has this indifferent mentality. He's got piss poor H&Ps. He lacked temperament and dedication. There was at least another provider that was supervising him and was incredibly alarmed about the remarks that Michael would make about how Nazis and the Holocaust were fascinating, and that was actually something that was noted in his student record as well. Some of the other residents complained about Michael. They're like, he's a really freaking weird guy. Residents normally critique interns during rounds, and so when it became Michael's turn to present in rounds and then he would get some critique from the residents, he would just drop down and start doing push-ups. Okay, that's weird. At the time of hire, no one had talked to SIU or even really noticed that he didn't graduate with his cohort. But now with a flood of these concerns and complaints, Dr. Hunt calls SIU and he asks him, hey, who the F did you send me? The Associate Dean, Howard Barrows, tells Dr. Hunt, my brother in Christ, you should have read all of his red flags in that dean's letter. To which Dr. Hunt's like, yeah, I don't read that shit. Well, Dr. Hunt finds said letter, and despite reading it and maybe having second thoughts about Michael, there was no consideration in terminating him. January of 1984, Dr. Hunt meets with Michael and he tells him, hey, you need to get your shit together and that your residency is hanging on by a thread. So in February, a patient named Ruth Barrick is being assessed by her nurse, Annie Ritchie. Ruth had fallen and hit her head 10 days ago and had sustained a cerebral hematoma. The condition was serious, but it wasn't life-threatening at the time. But she did nearly die January 31st, and that just so happened shortly after Michael's appeal for his negative review to be removed was rejected. So on that day, another nurse, Deborah Kennedy, she was giving Ruth her breakfast. Ruth's sitting up in bed. She's doing great, chit-chatting, whatever. Michael goes in at 9:45 to check on Ruth. And this was a weird time at the hospital because doctors were normally rounding at 6:30. Deborah brushes it off. And Michael's like, I got to talk to her. She's like, cool. So she steps out. 20 minutes later, Deborah goes back in to check on Ruth. And Michael's gone at this point, and she notices Ruth is now slumped in the bed. She goes over. Ruth is barely breathing. Her skin is like bluish color, and so they call it code blue. Michael, miraculously, is the first one to respond. Other providers show up as well to help, and after 45 minutes, Ruth was stabilized and transferred to ICU. So, February 6th, Annie is giving Ruth a bath and notices that her central venous pressure is low. We also call that CVP. It is the blood pressure in the vena cava near the right atrium of the heart, so the upper right part of the heart, which reflects on the amount of blood returning to the heart and the heart's ability to pump blood back into the arterial system. CVP helps estimate fluid volume status, assess cardiac function, and gauge the right ventricle's performance. Right ventricle would be bottom right. Annie steps out and asks for a provider to check out Ruth, check out this low CVP. And so she's going to go check on her other patients. She notices that Michael goes into Ruth's room and she's like, okay, cool. He's going to go check on her, and realizes after some time that she's like, I don't think he's come out. Maybe there's an issue with the central line. So she goes in to check on them. That's a good nosy nurse right there. The curtain is pulled in this double occupancy room, and Annie peeks over the curtain and asks Michael, hey, you good? You need anything? Michael's like, nah, get out. So Annie bounces. She ends up coming back again, and she's like, yo, you're still in here? Do you need help? And Michael's like, no. So finally some time had passed after that. She sees Michael leave the room. She's like, all right, cool. So she goes in to check on Ruth. Ruth was completely blue. And Annie started screaming for a code blue. She started mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and she looked up, and who's standing there watching her? Michael. And what does he say to her? That's so disgusting. Referring to the mouth-to-mouth. Okay, he doesn't do anything to help her. He just stands there and watches. So others rush in to help, but Ruth had passed. The manner of death was ruled as a cardiopulmonary arrest due to a stroke. So as this traumatic event and that weird-ass behavior from Michael were still circling her brain, Annie is called to another patient's room that was having difficulty breathing. And who's in that room? None other than Michael himself. He asked for a heart monitor, to which Annie yelled at him, it's a respiratory issue, you idiot, not a cardiac. I mean, those are my words. And Michael's like, no, we need a cardiac monitor. And Annie's like, again, it's a respiratory issue, not a cardiac. So the charge nurse steps in and tells Annie, hey, I'm going to take this over. I'm going to get the patient to the unit. You go take a minute, right? Annie knew in the back of her mind that night while she drove home, something's not right with Michael. Rena Cooper was a 69-year-old widow, and she had a procedure done on her lower back. And Iwonia Utz is a 59-year-old woman who was scheduled for a brain tumor procedure. For 12 days, these two women shared a room, and they became friendly with each other. I mean, they're basically besties, right? The day after the Ruth incident, the doctors were doing an evening round, and they stopped in to check on these two women. Everything's going well. About an hour later, a nursing student rounded on them, and she was surprised to see Michael's in the room. Rena had requested more pain meds, and Michael had answered the light. So the student thought, okay, maybe, he's flushing something into her IV. Maybe it just kind of clotted off. Maybe he's trying to help. The student leaves the room to continue her night to prevent, getting behind when she hears Iwonia call out, are you okay, Mrs. Cooper? The next thing she hears is a violent rattling of the bed rails and Iwonia screaming. The student runs in to see that Rena is blue and she's not breathing anymore. She runs back out to the nurse's station, and the staff call a code blue, When the student was questioned about what had happened, she told the senior resident that Michael had just been in the room and was giving something in Rena's IV. Iwonia starts screaming about how that blonde doctor killed Mrs. Cooper, and she basically saw the whole thing. So while this shit show's going on, okay, a CNA, Joe Risley, decides, okay, well, they've got this going on. I'm going to go check out, the other patients, make sure there's nothing else. He catches Michael coming out of another room, and Joe notices he's wearing a look of satisfaction. He basically has a shit-eating grin. But Joe's not down with the sickness, and he goes, okay, I'm going to go into that room he just came out of, and he notices there's an 18-gauge needle on a 10cc syringe. Joe catches a charge nurse and asks, hey, is this patient due for an injection? To which the charge nurse is like, well, not that I'm aware of. No, not recent. The two look at the syringe, noting that it wasn't disposed of in the proper receptacle, and to which the charge nurse wraps a paper towel around it and tells Joe, you are my witness. Back in Rena's room, she's starting to respond to treatment. They had intubated her, so they put a breathing tube down her throat, and so she's starting to kind of breathe on her own. She's awake, and she gestures she wants to write a note. She scrawls on a pad, he put something in my IV. Someone gave me some med in my IV and paralyzed my lungs and heart. Michael goes on to deny ever being in Rena's room to all the staff and the attending providers. The supervisor, RN Sharon Black, was the one who allowed Rena to write on the paper, and she actually took statements from all of the staff as well, and she placed all of that into a sealed envelope and left it for the director of surgical nursing. Sharon reaches out to the head nurse of the floor as well, Amy Moore, to let her know what had happened, and the charge chipped in too about finding that random ass syringe. Now, Amy starts thinking about how, you know what? Yeah, they have had an increase in number of deaths on the floor. Cynthia McGee, she's a young gymnast from University of Illinois. She was found dead in her room. 6 days later, 21-year-old Richard DeLong was found dead in his room. 43-year-old Rain Walter died unexpectedly after a nurse found him agonal breathing. Michael had been a common denominator amongst all these patients. Amy reaches out to the Associate Executive Director for Nursing to voice her concerns. This climbs up the pole to the hospital's executive director and top administrator, the surgeon who operated on Rena, and the university vice president for health services and dean of the College of Medicine. These individuals met to discuss these deaths and the possibility of Michael being involved. The surgeon who worked on Rena, Dr. Goodman, listened to these statements from the nurses and the evidence that they had, but his major concern was that, this is the nurses' grapevine gossip, and they're all overreacting and recklessly spreading virulent and unfounded gossip about a fellow doctor. This is also the same guy that had a reputation of being a young, arrogant dickhead of a surgeon with zero bedside manner. Dr. Goodman really just thought that this was all out of hand. He talked with Dr. Larry Carey, the chief of surgery, and so they called Michael into his office. They tell him about the uproar from the staff about Rena and that he should take some time off from the hospital till this all clears. Dr. Carey asked Michael directly, did you put anything into her IV? To which Michael denied. And he's like, nope, I just went into there because one of the women, I don't remember which one, had pressed her call light, said her feet were cold, and so I put her slippers on her feet and then I left right after. Goodman is tasked with investigating Michael's activities, and instead of doing the right thing, he didn't talk to any of the nurses who had witnessed the events or the CNA. He didn't ask to see the syringe. There were no autopsies, no physical tests ordered for the past and maybe possible, current victims. There's no blood tests ordered. He didn't even consult a toxicologist. He was more concerned about the inflammatory rumors from the staff that he limited who can contact the director of nursing, and then he ended up moving Rena off the floor in efforts to try and calm this fire down. And, to no one's surprise, Goodman's conclusion was more dismissive than that initial meeting. He said that whoever did that to Rena was neither nurse nor physician, but maybe a pharmacy tech, which is kind of funny because they say that there's actually no blonde pharmacy tech, so no one really knows allegedly who it was. As for the other 7 deaths that were suspicious, he claimed that the patients were severely ill and that their deaths were clearly explainable medically, but then he doesn't go on to explain it. Michael was ordered to return to the hospital, but he would be closely monitored. It all felt like the accusers, are females and that the defenders were male, and that this investigation was more to exonerate Michael so that way the hospital didn't have to take any shame or embarrassment or legal liability for him. The same day Michael was exonerated, 72-year-old Charlotte Warner was suffering from leukemia, and she had had her spleen removed by Dr. Mark Cooperman. She's doing great post-op. She moved from the ICU to the floor, and then that night she was found slumped in her bed dead. Autopsy concluded that she had had massive blood clots all over her body. We're talking liver, kidneys, lungs, and her left coronary artery. Evelyn Perroni was another surgical patient, although it did not mention what type of surgery or how old she was, and she was found bleeding all over her body, even her eyes. It is not known it didn't state in the book if she had died or not. So February 20th, Mary Popko, she came to visit her 22-year-old daughter, Anna Mae, who had undergone intestinal surgery for deformed bowels. She's sitting there with her daughter, chit-chatting, and Michael comes in and he says, "Hey, I need to give her an injection. Can you step out?" Initially, Mary was hesitant. She's like, "I want to stay here and hold my daughter's hand." But Michael's like, "Nope, you got to get the hell out." Later that afternoon, Michael summoned Mary to a small conference room, kicked back in the chair, put his feet up on the table, and said, "She's dead now. You can go look at her." Mary remembers how Michael almost seemed happy, like it lifted his ego or something. So in April, Michael completed his general surgery rotation, and he had moved to the Children's Hospital for his pediatric rotation. One night, he offered to get KFC for the residents on duty with him. And, they were like, "Hey, just go ahead and get some big buckets of chicken." Michael's like, "Nah, let's keep it separate." I'm sure your butt is probably already starting to pucker like mine did. He brings back the chicken, divvies it out, and all 3 ate their chicken and then fell violently ill for over a week. Like, so bad that another resident was in the OR vomiting into their mask. Now, luckily, wasn't able to find anything about kids being harmed, so thank God. So when it comes down time for Michael to do his neurosurgery rotation, Dr. Carol Miller wrote a letter to Dr. Hunt telling him that Swango was a no-go. Dr. Miller was assigned to oversee him during this rotation, and she said that Michael didn't demonstrate the qualities required of a neurosurgeon. Dr. Ferguson was that transplant doctor, and he wrote a letter saying hell no. He actually urged Michael to be fired. Because of these letters, the university told Michael that he's not going to get that residency after all. But due to a fear of a lawsuit, they allowed him to complete his internship and continue working at the university hospitals. 5 days after receiving that letter that told Michael his residency was toast, 3 doctors submitted letters in his support. These 3 letters reduced the severity of his actions down to personality differences. So in September 1984, Michael received his medical license to practice in Ohio. He would actually end up going back to his hometown in Illinois the next July, telling his friends and his family he just didn't like the hospital or the people there. He took up a position with another ambulance company while he waited for his medical license to be approved in Illinois. His reputation for being a weird guy had already preceded him. Michael was known to pace the room and just keep repeating that, "I just want something to happen. I just want something to happen." It always seemed like he was on edge all the time. Anytime they pulled up to a bad accident, he would get incredibly excited. Especially if they discovered a fatality, oh man, he was off his rocker. If he missed the scene, he would grill his colleagues about, what happened? What did it look like? What did you see? At work, he would work on those creepy ass scrapbooks of death, poison, and violent scenes. When he was asked, "Why do you have so many articles about poison?" he said, "That's a good way to kill people." One night, the crew was watching TV when a story broke out about a mass shooting at a McDonald's, and Michael jumps up, turns the volume all the way up on the TV, and started yelling, "That's just great. I love it. I wish I could have been there. Every time I think of a good idea, somebody beats me to it." He would sexually harass his female coworkers, but tell them his fantasies, And those sexual fantasies often involved like burying a hatchet into the back of their head. So it's like sexual and violence fantasies were just kind of becoming one. And keep in mind, Michael has a girlfriend at this time, Rita Dumas. She is a nurse back at the Ohio State University Hospital. So September, Michael decides to grace his coworkers with donuts one morning. And you can probably guess where this is going. About a half an hour after a coworker had a donut, they became violently ill. 15 minutes later after that, 4 more got sick as well. You know, they called Michael out. They're like, hey, did you poison us? And he was like, oh, no, I don't know what's wrong with him. So he ends up taking the donuts down to the nurse's station at the hospital that they were based at. The crew was so sick that they actually ended up going to the ED and telling, you know, the doctors there, like, hey, we all think we have food poisoning. They had to leave work. So instead of looking at this crazy ass guy who's like all about poisoning and like death and all that, the donut shop was turned into the Department of Health and they were inspected. The bout of food poisoning was passed off as an unidentified virus and the donut shop was cleared. And so he actually did this 3 more times to his coworkers under the guise of like getting them sodas or like an iced tea. When he was out on a run one night, his coworkers found ant poison in his bag, and that contains arsenic. So they start looking up, what are the symptoms of arsenic poisoning? His coworkers go on to actually set him up. They make a kind of like a decoy pot of tea. They leave it unattended. And after Michael's been around it, they ended up having it tested, and it tested positive for heavy metals. They took this finding to the head of Adams County Health Department, and they laid out all of their evidence. You know, they felt as if like Michael was experimenting with arsenic doses in order to get the right amount to kill somebody. At the time that they were having a president-elect come into the city, and so they were very concerned, okay, is he going to go after him? So the director, Gene Mann, is like, you know what? Hell yeah, like we need to get the police involved. So he picks up the phone to give him a little ring. And that's where I'm going to end. We will continue this next week. I'm so sorry. I hate to have to, you know, make this more than one part, but I think in order to really cover the story, I have to, right? Here's to hoping that I don't have to do 3 parts, and I could just do 2. But if you want to stay in the loop, you can go on over to the IG at Under the Scrubs podcast. And I will see you guys next Tuesday as we continue our Michael Swango journey. Okay, love you. Bye.